Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. This is Thomas again, and this video is going to serve as the first installment of what I hope is going to be kind of a long and interesting video series I'm going to call the Mosaic Training Project. And I know it sounds a little bit new agey, but the name will kind of make sense in a little bit. So the purpose of this series was to, rather than give a prescriptive training plan that's sort of a do these 5 things and you'll be bouldering 2 grades harder type of thing. It's more of a documentation of what I am going to try. I'm going to do a lot of experimentation, and I'm going to try to assess individual types of workouts in this training plan and kind of see how they work in terms of the overall progression. So back to the mosaic idea. What I tend to do as a climber looking for training ideas is I go out and consume a lot of content, whether that's podcasts or videos or written articles or whatever. And I try to pick out individual aspects of other people's training plans that I think will be useful. And I kind of use those to build up this, mosaic, if you will, of a training plan. And I find that has been very helpful in terms of tailoring a plan for me. So rather than see somebody publish one of their really good training plans that has worked really well for them and try to follow that method exactly, that I have found is kind of a recipe for disappointment. And rather than that, being able to build up this plan out of individual aspects makes it feel a little bit easier to kind of mix and match, pull things out that aren't working, and put in new things. So the content that I'm talking about is coming from people who are much more knowledgeable than I am. I don't have a background in physiology or nutrition. Those people are much stronger than I am, for sure. And also, let's be honest, they're generally much more entertaining than I am. So you might be asking yourself, why the hell should I watch this rather than just going out? What do you bring to the table? What do I bring to the table? So I can say pretty honestly that the main thing that I bring to the table is my lack of talent. Yeah. So you might be wondering why that's a positive thing, but generally speaking, I have been climbing for about 13 years now, 12, 13, and I have never been talented in terms of my climbing. There's never been something that I have progressed in super quickly. It's been a bit of a slog throughout that time. I've hit multiple very long plateaus that I've had to push through. And I've gotten to the level that I have over a very long time. I think that will be a positive in the end for this kind of experiment, just in terms of trying to isolate what the actual training that I'm doing, what effect that actually has on my end climbing. So hopefully we can chalk it up to the actual training and not kind of any innate talent that I might have, because there ain't much. So first, let me just go over a few kind of rules, or not rules, but guidelines of creating a training plan for yourself that I have found very helpful. So number one is make your own plan. Don't just follow somebody else's. I know it's easy to get hyped up about somebody, who is now, going to the Olympics or something, and kind of you can attach your training plan to that, and it gives you a bit more excitement to actually to go do it. But I found there are a few things that go into this in terms of making your own plan. One, it's much easier to keep it flexible. So I have tried a few plans that are laid out by super strong people and people who are much better at recovery. They can, put a lot more training load in than I can. And it felt pretty bad when right off the bat I realized, in the first week, there's no way I'm going to be able to maintain this. And I had to start paring it back. and it felt like I had already kind of failed. Um, but if I had kind of taken the ideas of that and started to build up my own plan from that, it would have been much easier to start slow and add things and remove things. And I think I wouldn't have felt so attached to the final, plan that they laid out that they follow. So that's one thing. The other part of that is if you can try to identify your weaknesses, your personal weaknesses in climbing. For instance, for me, I have found that my power is pretty bad. As soon as I can't really use my feet to generate, I find that like my pulling power is pretty low compared to other people. So, for instance, that's one thing I want to emphasize in my training that other people might not need to. The next guideline that is helpful to do or helpful to keep in mind is to give your training plan time before changing it. Now, this you kind of have to caveat this with if something's clearly not working or if you're clearly overtraining, feel free to change it right then and there. But generally, don't find some new cool thing that you see a video on, immediately incorporate it and get rid of something that you haven't really had time to flesh out in your training. So if you're constantly switching hangboard protocols, for example, it's going to be very difficult to tell what worked because I'm sure, as most of you know, climbing training takes a decent amount of time to take effect for you to actually see it. So it's kind of hard to track back what actually worked for you so you can continue doing it in the future and getting better. So that's another piece. Number 3 is try to find a way to measure your progress. And this is something I really want to talk to more knowledgeable people. I actually work with quite a few data scientists, and I kind of want to pick their brain on a potential way to quantify this a little bit better. But what I have been doing, just as a practical thing, is I have set up a kind of a set self-assessment that I do every once in a while. I'm trying to do it like every 2 weeks or so to keep track of progress. And I'll go over the actual assessment in a later video. But I'm trying to do that. I also try to keep a set of projects of mine, both outdoor and indoor, like on a tension board in my case, that sort of emphasize certain aspects of climbing. So I might have a project that's very powerful or a project that is super crimpy or compression-y or whatever. And if I can be dedicated about it and go back to those projects every once in a while, I'm hoping that might reveal any kind of progress in those areas. That's always kind of tricky because as you get better beta, that makes the climbs easier and everything. So it might be a little bit tough to track back the actual training, but I'm hoping that it can actually be a little bit helpful anyway. And then the fourth one, and this is one that I always have trouble with, and especially when I started training, it's hard to keep in mind, but as many people will remind you over and over again when you ask training questions, climbing is still very much a skill-based sport. And that being said, most of your time should still be spent climbing. So this is kind of a sliding scale that people don't talk about too much, where I think if you have very limited time that you can spend on climbing/training, you should be spending pretty much all of that on actual climbing, getting the movement down. And also, if you're a beginner, this is going to be the most fun way to train, but also the most effective to get better for quite a while. But then I feel like there is a minimum amount of like raw time that you should spend on climbing. And then beyond that, I think you can dedicate more and more time to training. So, you might have heard of some of the Olympic athletes training protocols. Well, they'll spend hours and hours in a gym, and a lot of that time will be training, but it's because they have that much raw time, they can still spend, 2-3 hours actually climbing, and then they might spend a full hour or two on just flexibility. or other training methods too. But anyway, so try to keep that balance. Don't get stuck into the cycle of only training, because I think with the pandemic forcing me to, I only had access to basically a hangboard at that point, and at the time I thought, oh yeah, I'll be able to train and I'll be super strong when I get back. And when I did get back to the gym, I found that was pretty weak. Like my fingers felt good, but it was amazing how many little muscles and things for like compression and just body tension that were lost that are very difficult to train without actually climbing. So anyway, keep that in mind. Keep climbing. It's what you want to do anyway. So try to keep that as part of your training. Okay, so let's go over some of these types of periodization. So most people know, but the term periodization is really just kind of how you structure your overall training, your kind of long-term training cycle. And there are a few different groups that your plan might kind of fall under. And I'm sure there are more as well, but there are kind of three, maybe four that I hear about a lot, especially with climbing. The first one is the simple one. It's concurrent periodization. So you might think of it a bit kind of like not periodization, but the idea is that you're working on everything all the time. And you might be progressively, increasing the load on those things. If you're getting a little bit more advanced, and then maybe backing off when you're feeling tired, and that is kind of your overall training plan. And this works pretty well, especially for beginners. So the pros are, it's more fun. You're kind of working on everything. It keeps you a bit more motivated. It's a bit more variety in your weekly climbing routine. And again, yeah, it's easy to work on this kind of stuff when you're a beginner, when it doesn't take that much stimulus to get better at certain things. The cons are pretty big once you get more advanced. So it's difficult to know if you're interested in it. It's difficult to track back in terms of what type of workout helped with your overall progress. If I'm working on everything during a week, it's tough to kind of identify what my actual weakness was if my climbing gets better, for instance, to know kind of if I need to focus on one thing or not. It's also, in my opinion, is very prone to plateauing. So again, once you get past those, quote, noob gains that you might see when you're first starting to train for climbing, where it might only take like one hangboard workout a week to really get you enough stimulus to get you stronger. The concurrent method, unless you have a huge amount of time to spend on it, kind of breaks down in terms of pushing beyond those sort of plateaus. So as soon as you have to focus on one thing a little bit more to really see gains in it, it doesn't really work logistically that well. On the other end of the spectrum is the full kind of linear classical periodization. And this is something that you might have run into if you read like the Anderson brothers ideas and things like that. But the idea here is that you kind of go the opposite of the concurrent. You split up your training cycles to focus on individual aspects for a very long period of time. So let's just take strength, power endurance, or strength endurance, whatever you want to call it, in terms of the aspects that you want to work on. So in the linear periodization, you would work on only strength for a block of, let's say, 4 weeks. And during that time, you would be progressively increasing the load in your workouts, your strength workouts. And then once you get to the end of those 4 weeks, you might take a quick rest week, and then you move on to power, and that is your focus. And the idea behind this is that you're working on things in a specific order. So the order that I laid out, strength, power, power, endurance, strength, endurance, whatever, is intentional in that strength is something that is very difficult to make gains in, but it's also very easy to maintain. So once you break through and your strength goals and you get stronger, you don't lose that as quickly. Whereas as you go down that line to power, and then on the other end, like endurance stuff, it's very easy, very quick to make the gains there, but you also lose it very quickly. So the idea is by the end of your full, kind of macro cycle thing of training, you have this kind of peaking phase where all of those things line up and you are at the peak in every single one of those individual aspects. So the pros here, what I find is that it's much easier for me to focus on individual things during the cycle. So it's easier to focus on like my hangboarding as a pure thing that I want to work on, if that's the only thing that I'm working on at that time. And it also, because of that, it kind of forces you to focus on each thing, even if you don't really like that or think you need to work on that. So in this method, I have to do, have to. I am intentionally focusing on my hangboarding for a while, and that is something that it might reveal some weaknesses that you didn't think that you had. Whereas normally you might think, my finger strength is fine. Like I don't need to make that much improvement there to get better. If you have to focus on that for 4 weeks and then you see later that, oh yeah, now I feel a lot better on this project because my fingers feel a lot stronger. It's a little bit easier to kind of track back and see what improvements in your training translated to improvements in your performance. The cons are pretty obvious as well in terms of is very structured. If you don't like this kind of structure, it can definitely be a bit of a burden to adhere to. And then you also wind up with these peaking windows, which if you want to be climbing all year round, they can be a bit of a pain to plan around. So this kind of method works really well if you tend to take a lot of trips. Like where I used to live, we didn't have much outdoor climbing right nearby, so we would plan trips to go somewhere. And this works really well if that is the case, where I could plan out 6 months in advance and say, okay, I'm going to go on a trip here. I'm going to plan my full training cycle to line up with that trip. That works really well. And then the other thing that is tough to deal with the linear periodization, and I'm finding this now as I'm kind of finishing up the first set of cycles here, is it's can be kind of frustratingly rigid in terms of making changes, which can be a pro or a con. Again, it's nice in that it does force you to give something time to work before you just throw it out and dismiss it. But on the other hand, if you know something isn't working or you see something else that you want to incorporate, it can feel, like I said, a bit rigid in terms of you probably want to wait until your next cycle before you pull that in, just so you don't mess up your data. Again, if you care about kind of figuring out what works for you. So that's the linear version. There's kind of a subversion of that, which is a bit confusing when it comes to climbing. This people call the undulating method, and instead of progressively loading the aspect that you're doing, you kind of you'll see any graphics on this where it's like an undulating wave of loading and deloading as you go. I haven't heard a huge amount of benefit to that method over the linear periodization. It doesn't seem like it helps a huge amount, but I'm not really sure. That one again is a little bit of a mystery to me in terms of why you might do that. The other kind of hybrid approach, which I think works very well for some people, and is what I usually did before trying out this kind of more strict, going back to the more strict linear method, is conjugate periodization. And the idea here is that you're hoping to maintain all of the aspects of climbing. So again, let's say, strength, power endurance. But you're cycling through and focusing on one of those aspects for a certain amount of time. So that might mean that, okay, I am in my strength phase. So maybe I do 2 hangboard workouts in a week, and then like my power workout, campusing or whatever, and then my power endurance workout as well. And then when I move on to focus on power, I might do 1 hangboard session a week to maintain that strength, and then 2 power sessions, and then the power endurance session, and so forth. So the pros here is that it keeps you fit, fairly fit most of the year, basically all of the year, because you're maintaining all of this stuff at a pretty high level. I don't think that you would get that same fitness that you would in the pure peaking phase of the linear periodization, but you might. I'm not really sure how much lower that fitness might be. The other pro is that it's very flexible. So, you don't have to plan out this thing and adhere to it. You can kind of mix it up as you go. So I think that is a possible one. The cons for conjugate, and this is probably more to me personally, it's difficult to fit in all of the stuff in a week. So the example that I gave is pretty simple: strength, power endurance. Sure, like I can fit in 4 workouts in a week so that I can focus on one thing or another. But as soon as you start to add in more, let's say I wanted to do more hypertrophy, you're adding in another session, and in order to both add that session in and be able to focus on it, you're kind of cramming in a lot to an individual, microcycle, which would be like a week in our case. And so that is one thing I found, and especially if you're going all the way to, like if you're a sport climber and you want to add in endurance on the other end, you're again kind of cramming in a lot. So your sessions might tend to be longer, or you have to add more of them. And I think the risk for overtraining might be a little bit more if you're trying to do that. That's one thing I found anyway. Like when I tried to work on, I was looking at like the Alex Barrow's plan. I found that I very quickly got into a state of overtraining, trying to cram in all of that stuff. The other thing that I found, and again, it's kind of personal for me, is that it's easy because you're kind of given that flexibility. It's a little bit easier to bias your training toward the things that you either like consciously like, or that you feel you need to get stronger at. And it can be that freedom can mean that you might neglect things that you don't know that you're weak in. So if you're strict about it and you go through, it can work. But sometimes I found myself cycling through and maybe doing a couple more focused weeks on hangboarding than I might have done on my power training. And I think that was a detriment to my training personally, is it was difficult to pinpoint my personal weaknesses. So that's the conjugate method. And I do think it is a good one for people. It's probably like the generally most applicable to most people's training plans, just because it's so flexible, but it still gives you a bit of structure around what you're actually doing and a bit of guidance. But in this case, I'm going to try the full classical linear periodization, mostly, like I said, in order to identify and track back the what improvements in my training translated to improvements in my performance. Okay, so let's just go through the actual plan here. And this will be just the overview, and then I'll do a bunch of individual videos going over the different cycles. So like I said, I'm going to try a linear periodization model. And then obviously within each of those blocks, I'm going to work on, progressively increasing that load to hopefully get into that overloaded state, and then take a bit of a rest and go on to the next one, the next type of block here. So again, hopefully this means that the fact that I have to focus and work on each of the aspects of my climbing. I'm hoping that I can kind of uncover the weakness and train it at the same time and figure out what exercise is best for training that weakness. So the general schedule that I'm going to try is going to split up the block and split it up into 3 different blocks. So I'm going to do a block of hypertrophy, which is kind of an interesting thing that people have different opinions on with climbing. Then going to move to strength, and then power. And I think normally you could do a period of strength endurance, what some people call power endurance after that, especially if you do sport climbing. I'm pretty much only bouldering at this point, and I generally don't have too much trouble with power endurance boulders. But anyway, it would be perfectly reasonable to add in power endurance at the end. I'm going to do 4 weeks on each, and then I'm going to take a deload week in between each of those. So I'm going to do 4 weeks of hypertrophy, take a deload week, move on to strength, deload week, power, and then I'll be in the peaking phase. So for the deload week, I'm going to try doing the method that a lot of weightlifters do, where they say if you're doing this deload week, it means that you are, overtrained, but you want to keep doing a little bit of something. So generally what I've heard is that you do 50% of either your reps, 50% of the weight you did on those reps, or both. If you really need to cut it down. So a lot of that I think will mean just going in, doing some light climbing, and then if you feel like it, doing some light work on the energy system that you just finished up on. So doing like a light hangboard workout or camp sport workout or whatever. But I'm going to treat those deload weeks mostly as just like fun climbing time and letting myself rest a bit more. So again, after that whole thing is done, I should be in, the peaking phase for about, I think like 3 to 4 weeks at that point. And going to take that time to basically climb as much as I can. So I'm hoping what I tend to do is go around, try to find projects outdoors, work through some beta, do that kind of stuff, and then I'm hoping to kind of stack those projects up, and then during those peaking phases, be able to actually send them. So for me, this means I'm going to have 3 cycles per year if this schedule holds. So I will aim to peak kind of in June, sort of do more like alpine kind of stuff. October, which is just the best time to climb in general, and then February, which here is actually pretty good as well. And the other thing to keep in mind for these, I'm going to try to be pretty strict on that 4 weeks just to see how it goes. But I think after a while, what you want to keep in mind is that if you want to keep it more flexible, and I think what a lot of like weightlifters would say is that if you are going through and you're realizing that you are plateauing at a certain thing for about 2 weeks in a row or so, that probably means you need to take a deload week and move on to the next. That could mean a couple of things in this case. It could either mean if you're late enough in that first block that you're plateauing in, maybe you take a deload and then go to the next one. Or if you're pretty early, you could also take a deload week or maybe even like half a week and then continue on with that same energy system. So I'm going to see how that goes as well, and we'll kind of see it through the course of the videos. But then hopefully going through that and then taking into account the individual assessments that I'm going to try to sprinkle in, hopefully every 2 weeks, along with the set of kind of benchmark projects, like actual climbing projects that I can go back to, will kind of give us a decent idea of any kind of progress being made. So anyway, stay tuned. Be sure to, subscribe if you want to see more. I think next I'll probably talk about the assessments and some of the individual stuff. And then we'll kind of get into the actual workouts that I'm going to try. All right. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.